The air conditioning's hushed drone was the sole sound in Mr. Abernathy's office, a stark counterpoint to the tempest brewing within the Sterling clan. Arthur occupied a rigid leather chair, inhaling the mingled scents of aged paper and polished timber. Opposite him, Beatrice, radiant in a tailored wine-dark silk dress, exhibited her restless impatience by repeatedly crossing and uncrossing her slender legs. Beside her, Charles, whose expensive suit never seemed to quite banish his perpetual dishevelment, toyed with his shirt cuff, a glint of smug anticipation tightening his features. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose visage appeared chiselled from granite, cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. "As you are aware, following the unfortunate passing of your father, Mr. Elias Sterling, we convene to hear the final disposition of his estate." His voice was a dry, uninflected monotone, mirroring the sterile surroundings. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes glinting with avarice. "Just get on with it, Abernathy. We haven't all day." Arthur remained silent, his gaze fixed on a hairline crack in the plaster above the lawyer's head. He anticipated what was to come, or so he believed. Years of being overshadowed, of being labelled the quiet one, the unambitious one, had conditioned him to expect little. Mr. Abernathy, unperturbed by Beatrice's interjection, continued. "To Miss Beatrice Sterling, your father bequeaths the sum of $25 million, along with a family residence in the Hamptons and the Sterling art collection." A sharp intake of breath from Beatrice was swiftly followed by a triumphant smirk aimed directly at Arthur. "Finally," she murmured, loud enough for all to hear. "To Mr. Charles Sterling," the lawyer intoned, "your father bequeaths the sum of $20 million, the Sterling yacht, and his controlling interest in Sterling Financial Services." Charles let out a whoop, then quickly composed himself, though his eyes darted to Beatrice, a silent challenge passing between them. "Excellent," he boomed, a wide grin revealing teeth that seemed a shade too bright. "Father always knew I was the one to take the reins." Arthur felt a dull throb behind his eyes. He hadn't expected millions, but the casual dismissal, the sheer transparency of his siblings' glee, stung nonetheless. He braced himself for the inevitable mention of the dusty old factory, a whimsical purchase his father had made decades ago and subsequently forgotten. "And finally," Mr. Abernathy paused, his gaze briefly meeting Arthur's, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "To Mr. Arthur Sterling. Your father bequeaths the Sterling Steelworks property on the industrial outskirts of town, along with all its contents." The words hung in the air, heavy and derisive. Sterling Steelworks. A derelict husk of a building, long abandoned, its machinery rusted solid, its windows shattered. It was a cruel jest, a final, cutting slight from a father who had always considered him a disappointment. Beatrice burst into a peal of laughter, sharp and brittle. "The steelworks! Oh, Arthur, how perfectly you!" She gestured dismissively with a perfectly manicured hand. "Are you going to turn it into a museum of neglect? Perhaps a home for stray cats?" Charles chuckled, a low rumble that vibrated through the room. "At least you won't have to worry about property taxes for long, Arthur. I imagine the city will condemn it any day now." He winked, completely oblivious to the cold fury that was beginning to simmer beneath Arthur's quiet exterior. "Maybe you can sell the scrap metal and buy yourself a decent meal." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a sudden rush of heat. He swallowed, the taste of ashes in his mouth. Humiliated, yes, but more than that, a strange sense of resolve began to harden within him. They saw him as a fool, a failure. They always had. But perhaps, just perhaps, They had underestimated the quiet man. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly steady, though it felt distant, as if coming from someone else. He pushed himself to his feet, the stiff leather groaning in protest. He ignored Beatrice's continued snickering and Charles's triumphant sneer. He simply nodded once, a gesture of quiet acceptance that, to his siblings, undoubtedly looked like capitulation. As he walked out of the opulent office, leaving the faint clinking of champagne flutes and the rising crescendo of his siblings' celebratory chatter behind, Arthur felt the full weight of the bitter inheritance. Yet amidst the bitterness, a tiny, defiant spark ignited. The Sterling steelworks, a heap of rust and ruin, or perhaps a blank canvas. He would not sell it, not yet. He would go see what his father had truly left him. The last walk-through. The morning's crisp bite offered no solace against the leaden weight in Arthur's chest. He cinched his simple woolen jacket tighter, a futile defence against a chill that seemed to seep from within. The Sterling steelworks, or its skeletal remains, cast a grim silhouette ahead, a monument to a bygone era and, he thought bitterly, to his own perceived failure. His siblings, Beatrice and Charles, were no doubt clinking glasses over millions in the Sterling estate, their laughter echoing in opulent halls, while he stood amidst ruin, an object of their pity and scorn. This, he vowed, was his final pilgrimage, a last, humiliating survey before listing the property. Perhaps a few paltry offers from scrap dealers or demolition crews, enough to cover outstanding taxes and stave off deeper embarrassment. The notion of shedding his father's legacy, however tarnished, sat heavy and sour. Yet, what alternative remained? He was a meticulous planner, a deep thinker, but even he couldn't conjure profit from rust and decay. With a sigh that tasted of defeat, Arthur nudged open the main gate. The hinges shrieked in protest, a banshee's wail across the vast, empty lot. Dust, thick and pervasive, immediately assailed him, tickling his nostrils, coating his tongue with an earthy film. Wind, unhindered by glassless panes, whistled through the main factory's cavernous interior, composing a symphony of groans and creaks that hinted at structural fatigue. He stepped inside, his sensible work boots crunching on generations of industrial detritus, shattered glass, crumbled brick, unidentifiable metal shards. The air hung thick with mildew, damp earth, and a vaguely metallic tang, like ancient blood. Weak, diffused sunlight speared through grime-filmed skylights, illuminating dancing motes in the stagnant air. The sheer scale of the place was overwhelming, even in its state of disrepair. Rows of colossal, dormant machinery stood like petrified beasts, gears locked, conveyor belts shredded. Rust had painted intricate orange lacework across their surfaces, transforming once formidable engines into delicate, decaying sculptures. His gaze drifted to the ceiling, once a cheerful industrial yellow, now a tapestry of water stains and peeling paint, some sections sagging precariously. Patches of moss clung defiantly to the interior brickwork, thriving in the damp, perpetual twilight. He noted the pervasive dampness, a cold, clinging presence that seeped into his bones. It wasn't merely rainwater, he realized. The very air had a persistent, clammy feel, as if the building itself were weeping. He moved methodically, a planner even in despair, mentally cataloguing the damage. The main power conduit, a thick serpent of insulated cable, hung severed and frayed near the entrance. Most of the wiring lay exposed, a dangerous tangle of copper and rubber. He observed the colossal furnaces, their gaping mouths cold and dark, hearths choked with ash and debris. Cranes, frozen mid-air on their tracks, stretched skeletal arms over vast, empty spaces where molten metal once flowed. Broken windows, like vacant eyes, stared out at the neglected grounds, some haphazardly boarded with rotting planks. He ran a hand along a grimy control panel. The plastic buttons cracked and faded, a ghost of the frantic activity they once commanded. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, snaked down his spine. This wasn't just a failed business. It was a tomb. A tomb for his father's ambition, and now, perhaps, for his own dwindling hopes. He rounded a corner, past a collapsed section of partition wall, and stopped abruptly. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the floor beneath his feet. He paused, listening. The wind continued its mournful song, but beneath it he discerned a low, rhythmic thrum, barely audible. Too regular to be natural, too persistent to be merely the building settling. He frowned, his methodical mind already searching for an explanation. It was a subtle inconsistency, a detail that pricked at his innate sense of order. He knelt, pressing a hand to the cold, grimy concrete. The vibration was definite, a faint pulse emanating from somewhere deeper within the complex, a sound that didn't belong in a derelict, abandoned factory. He stood, a flicker of something new stirring within him. Not hope, not yet, but a cautious curiosity, a feeling distinct from the embarrassment and sadness that had been his constant companions. He pushed deeper into the decaying structure, following the barely perceptible hum, his initial intention of a quick survey quickly forgotten. A peculiar wall. The rhythmic hum, a low thrum against the soles of his worn boots, had pulled Arthur deeper into the factory than he'd intended. His initial task was to catalogue the decay, to itemize the rust and the rot for the inevitable sale. He'd started in the main assembly hall, meticulously noting cracked skylights, the sag of the overhead cranes, and the thick dust motes dancing in the meagre sunlight. Each entry in his tablet was precise, a grim accounting of neglect. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his gaze sweeping over every beam, every exposed pipe, his mind already calculating repair costs that would never be recouped. As he ventured further, past the silenced stamping presses and dormant furnaces, the air grew cooler, carrying the faint metallic tang of stale oil and something else, something sharper, like ozone. The tremor intensified, a subtle vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock beneath the factory floor. It wasn't a structural instability, he'd already checked for that, but a consistent, almost deliberate pulse. It intrigued him, pulling him away from the familiar patterns of decay. He found himself in a section he rarely visited, a labyrinth of smaller workshops and storage rooms that had been sealed off years ago, long before his father's health had truly failed. The air here was heavy, still, and the dim light from his headlamp struggled to push back the encroaching shadows. He ran a gloved hand along a grimy brick wall, feeling the cold, rough texture beneath his fingertips. He was looking for the source of the hum, but his methodical nature led him to inspect the integrity of the structures themselves. That's when he saw it. Amidst the uniform, weathered brickwork of the old factory, a section of wall stood out. It wasn't the same age. The mortar lines were too crisp, too evenly spaced. The bricks themselves, though stained with the general grime of the factory, lacked the deep pitting and subtle variations in colour that characterised the surrounding construction. This section, perhaps 10 feet wide and reaching from floor to ceiling, was an anomaly, an interruption in the ancient tapestry of the building. It was too clean, too deliberate. Arthur paused, his headlamp beam fixed on the incongruous wall. He tapped it lightly with his knuckles. The sound was different too, a dull thud, lacking the hollow resonance of a true load-bearing wall, yet not entirely solid either. It suggested a cavity, or perhaps a different kind of material behind it. He pressed his ear against the cool bricks. The hum was distinctly louder here, a steady, almost melodic drone, vibrating directly through the material. His earlier intention of documenting decay vanished, replaced by a surge of cautious curiosity. This wasn't just a repair, it was an addition, a deliberate alteration. Why had his father, a man who notoriously hated unnecessary expenses, invested in a new wall in a section of the factory slated for disuse? And why was it so meticulously integrated, yet so clearly distinct? He ran his hand along the seam where the newer bricks met the old, searching for any telltale signs of a doorway or a hidden panel. The mortar was seamless, expertly applied, but he could feel a faint ridge, a tiny imperfection that spoke of two distinct phases of construction. He tried to pry at the mortar with a small tool from his kit, but it held fast. This wasn't a temporary measure, it was built to last, built to conceal. He stepped back, surveying the wall again. There were no obvious access points, no hinges, no handles. It was just a wall, a remarkably solid, new-looking wall in the midst of crumbling history. Yet, the hum persisted, a constant, undeniable presence. It was a secret, hidden in plain sight, and Arthur, the quiet, methodical son, felt an unexpected thrill. He wasn't just documenting neglect anymore. He was on the cusp of uncovering something else entirely. The factory, which he had come to dismiss as a tomb of failed dreams, suddenly pulsed with a hidden life. The secret door. Arthur's hand glided over the unusual stonework, its cold, smooth surface a jarring anomaly amidst the factory's rough, crumbling concrete. He tested it with a gentle push, then with more conviction, pressing his full weight against the largest block. He anticipated the unyielding resistance of a structural cornerstone. Instead, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor rippled through the wall. He froze, breath suspended, listening. The insistent hum, his guide to this place, seemed to intensify, vibrating not just in the air, but directly into the stone beneath his palm. He pushed again, harder this time, bracing his feet. The hum deepened, its pitch shifting, and with a low, grinding groan that resonated through the cavernous space, the section of wall retracted a few inches. A silent cloud of ancient dust bloomed outward, tasting of forgotten earth and rusted iron. Arthur coughed, waving a hand, his heart now a frantic drum against his ribs. This was no fluke. This was by design. A narrow, dark gap now bordered the recessed section, hinting at only deeper shadows beyond. He squinted, struggling to pierce the gloom. The air seeping from the opening was stale, thick with damp earth and an indefinable yet distinctly metallic note. Curiosity, a powerful, almost primal urge, now eclipsed his earlier caution. He had to see what lay within. His fingers traced the edge of the newly revealed opening, searching for a lever, a switch, anything to widen the passage. His hand brushed against a small, rough indentation near the bottom, just above where the concrete floor met the peculiar wall. Kneeling, he peered closer, discerning a faint outline, a tiny recess in the stone, almost invisible. Within it, nestled in a fine layer of ochre dust, lay a key. It was a simple, sturdy thing of tarnished iron, its teeth intricate and sharp even beneath the rust. He picked it up. The metal felt cool and substantial in his palm, a tangible link to a forgotten past. His gaze swept the immediate vicinity for a corresponding lock. His eyes landed on a subtle seam in the wall itself, a faint outline he'd overlooked before, camouflaged by years of grime and clever craftsmanship. This wasn't just a recessed section, it was a door, meticulously integrated. Tracing the seam, he found a small, almost invisible keyhole, perfectly sized for the key in his hand. With a surge of adrenaline, Arthur inserted the key. It slid in smoothly, a testament to the lock's enduring quality. He turned it. A soft click reverberated through the quiet factory, impossibly loud in the hushed anticipation. He withdrew the key, his hand trembling slightly. Now, to open it. He pushed the stone again, feeling for purchase, and found a faint ridge along the side of the door. Gripping it, he pulled. The door, heavy and made of some dark, unidentifiable metal, protested with a long, drawn-out shriek that sent shivers down his spine. It scraped against the floor, grating loudly as it slowly, reluctantly, began to swing inward. Each inch it moved revealed more of the impenetrable darkness beyond. The hum, previously a distant drone, now resonated through the very structure of the door, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in his bones. As the gap widened, the metallic, earthy scent intensified, now mixed with a faint, cloying sweetness he couldn't quite place. He peered into the blackness, unable to discern any features. It was a void, an absence of light so profound it seemed to absorb the ambient glow from the factory floor. Reaching into his pocket, his fingers closed around the small, powerful flashlight he carried. He clicked it on, the beam carving a stark path through the oppressive gloom. The light revealed a narrow, descending passage, lined with the same dark, unidentifiable metal as the door. The air here was still and cold, carrying a palpable sense of abandonment, of time having stood utterly still. The passage seemed to stretch endlessly into the depths, a silent, beckoning maw. Arthur took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, steeling himself. He stepped across the threshold, into the secret passage, leaving the familiar world of the decaying factory behind. The heavy door, still groaning softly, began to swing shut, its metallic shriek echoing his solitary entrance. He had found his father's secret. Now he would uncover its purpose. The heavy steel door, now open, exhaled a chill, musty breath into the stale factory air. Arthur hesitated on the threshold, the darkness beyond a physical presence. The hum, now a deep thrum, vibrated through the very floor beneath his worn boots, a pulse of anticipation that mirrored his own. He fumbled for the flashlight on his belt, its beam cutting a hesitant arc into the gloom. The passage sloped gently downward, the concrete walls rough and unpainted, a stark contrast to the polished brass mechanism of the door he'd just opened. Dust motes danced in the flashlight's cone, a silent, swirling ballet. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying a faint scent of old wood and something metallic, like aged brass. He moved slowly, deliberately, his senses on high alert. The silence, broken only by his soft footsteps and the persistent thrum, was profound, a weight pressing in on him. The passage opened into a larger chamber, a rectangular room carved deep beneath the factory floor. It was unlike anything above. Here, there were no towering machinery or grease-stained concrete. Instead, The space was dominated by rows of wooden crates, stacked neatly, almost reverently, along the walls and across the centre. Their surfaces were thick, with a fine, undisturbed layer of grey dust, testifying to years, perhaps decades, of forgotten solitude. Shelves lined one wall, laden with what appeared to be ledgers and metal boxes, all similarly shrouded. The air felt heavy with the passage of time, a stagnant breath held for too long. Arthur's beam swept across the crates. They varied in size, some small enough to lift easily, others robust and clearly designed for heavy contents. His gaze settled on one of the larger crates near the front, its wooden planks dark with age. A faint, almost imperceptible gleam caught his eye. A small, tarnished brass latch. The hum seemed to intensify, a silent command. He approached, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The wood felt rough and splintered beneath his fingertips as he brushed away the dust. The latch, though old, gave way with a soft click. He gripped the edge of the lid, his breath catching in his throat, and slowly, carefully, lifted it. Inside, nestled amongst layers of ancient yellowed newspaper, was a sight that stole the air from his lungs. The flashlight beam, trembling slightly in his hand, illuminated a cascade of gold. Not just a few coins, but hundreds, perhaps thousands, piled in gleaming heaps. They were old, undeniably so, with intricate designs and Latin inscriptions, their surfaces dulled by time, but still radiating an undeniable, profound wealth. Interspersed with the coins were thick stacks of paper money, bound with brittle rubber bands, their denominations faded but still legible. Large, almost forgotten bills from a bygone era, $100 notes emblazoned with a stern-faced Franklin, 500s, even thousands. Arthur stared, his mind struggling to process the visual information. This wasn't a few trinkets. This was a fortune. A hidden, secret fortune buried beneath a derelict steelworks. The sheer audacity of it, the meticulous planning, the years of concealment, it was breathtaking. He reached into the crate, his fingers trembling, and pulled out a gold coin. It was heavy, cool, and surprisingly smooth, a tangible piece of history, a whisper of a world he never knew his father inhabited. The intricate details of a monarch's profile, the date, 1889, stood out with startling clarity. He let the coin drop back into the pile with a soft clink, the sound echoing in the silent room. Then he reached for one of the stacks of old currency. The paper felt crisp, yet fragile, almost like parchment. He fanned through the notes, the sheer volume of them overwhelming. These weren't just collector's items, they were valid, if antiquated, currency. The implications settled over him like a heavy blanket. His father, the quiet, unassuming man who had seemingly left him nothing but debt, had built an empire, not just a steelworks. A hidden empire, meticulously constructed and secretly maintained, for reasons Arthur could not yet fathom. The hum was no longer just a sound. It was a revelation, a silent symphony accompanying the unveiling of a profound truth. He closed the crate lid slowly, his movements deliberate, his mind reeling. The other crates, the shelves of ledgers, the untouched metal boxes, what other secrets did they hold? This wasn't merely a discovery, it was an awakening. The weight of his inheritance, once a burden, now felt electrified, charged with an unimaginable potential. He looked around the room, no longer with trepidation, but with a growing sense of awe and a nascent thrill of purpose. The derelict steelworks, his supposed humiliation, was a key to something far grander, far more intricate than he or his siblings could ever have imagined. the hidden empire. The air in the subterranean vault, once thick with the scent of forgotten dust and metallic tang, now hummed with Arthur's focused energy. He moved with a newfound purpose, each action deliberate, almost ritualistic. The single bare bulb, hanging precariously from a makeshift fixture, cast long, dancing shadows that mimicked the frantic turning of his mind. The initial shock of the gold had worn off, replaced by a consuming urge to understand. What else lay hidden beneath the grime and disuse? Beyond the initial crate of coins, others lay stacked, less conspicuously, against the far wall. Their surfaces were scarred, bearing the marks of time and rough handling, yet they exuded a silent promise of further revelations. Arthur carefully prized open the lid of the nearest one. Instead of more glittering wealth, a dense stack of leather-bound ledgers greeted him, their pages brittle with age, their corners dog-eared and worn. Beneath them lay bundles of yellowed documents, tied with fraying twine, and scattered loose-leaf papers covered in his father's distinctive, sprawling hand. He settled cross-legged on the cold concrete floor, the beam of his headlamp cutting through the gloom, illuminating the first ledger. The handwriting, familiar, yet now imbued with an entirely new significance, detailed transactions, dates, and names that meant nothing to him. He recognized the meticulousness, the careful balancing of figures, but the context was utterly alien. These weren't the standard accounts of sterling steelworks. The numbers were too vast, the enterprises too diverse. Shipping manifests for exotic hardwoods, invoices for rare minerals, contracts for agricultural commodities from distant lands. The breadth was staggering, the scope truly global. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil. Arthur's world narrowed to the confines of the vault, his senses attuned only to the rustle of paper, the scratch of his pen as he made notes, and the rhythmic beat of his own heart, now a drum of rising excitement. He worked methodically, creating a system. He sorted documents by date, cross-referenced names, and painstakingly pieced together fragmented transactions. The initial bewilderment slowly gave way to dawning comprehension, then to a breathtaking realization. His father, the quiet, unassuming man who had run a single, struggling steelworks, had been living a double life. His siblings had scoffed, dismissing their father's legacy as a failing industrial relic. They had clamoured for the liquid assets, the bank accounts, oblivious to the true inheritance. Arthur, however, was uncovering an elaborate, intricately woven tapestry of international trade and clandestine investments. The ledgers spoke of shell corporations in tax havens, of silent partnerships in burgeoning industries across continents, of shrewd acquisitions made under pseudonyms. He found records of diamond mines in Africa, vast timber concessions in South America, and extensive property holdings in burgeoning Asian markets. There were moments of frustration, pages where the entries were deliberately vague, dates that didn't quite align, suggesting a conscious effort to obscure. But Arthur, fueled by a nascent sense of vindication and an insatiable curiosity, pressed on. He saw patterns emerge, a consistent reinvestment strategy, an uncanny foresight in identifying lucrative ventures, a relentless drive to expand. This wasn't just a fortune, it was an empire, built with audacious secrecy and an almost ruthless efficiency. His father hadn't merely accumulated wealth. He had orchestrated a complex global network, all while maintaining the facade of a struggling industrialist in a provincial town. The steelworks, Arthur now understood, was less a primary business and more a meticulously crafted smokescreen, a mundane front behind which a titan of industry operated in the shadows. Each discovery was a jolt, a recalibration of everything he thought he knew about his father. The man he'd seen as a quiet, somewhat defeated figure was in reality a master manipulator, a visionary whose true genius had been hidden in plain sight. The sheer scale of it was almost overwhelming. The numbers dwarfed anything his siblings had inherited, making their millions seem like pocket change. Arthur felt a strange mix of awe and trepidation. This wasn't just money, it was power, influence on a scale he couldn't yet fully grasp. He had stumbled into the heart of a hidden world, a legacy far grander and infinitely more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. The hum of discovery in the vault had intensified, a silent testament to the colossal secret he now held. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, revealing a portrait of his father that was both shocking and electrifying. Whispers and wonder. The clink of ice in Beatrice's gin and tonic was the only sound for a moment, a tiny bell tolling in the opulent silence of her drawing room. "He's still there," she said, her voice a low purr of irritation. "Days, Charles, days." Charles, sprawled inelegantly across a velvet chaise longue, grunted, his eyes fixed on the financial news flickering across a muted television screen. "Who, Arthur? Still playing factory owner?" he scoffed, the sound devoid of humour. "Thought he'd have given up by now, crying into his dusty ledgers." "That's just it," Beatrice countered, setting her glass down with a decisive thud. "He's not. Mr. Henderson, the estate manager, he called again, said Arthur's been different. Not just moping about, asking questions, ordering supplies, actual work, Charles. Can you imagine?" Charles finally tore his gaze from the screen, a flicker of genuine curiosity in his eyes. "Work? Arthur? Since when did our dear brother develop a work ethic that extends beyond alphabetizing his stamp collection?" He swung his legs to the floor, leaning forward. "What kind of supplies?" "Oh, nothing grand." Beatrice waved a dismissive hand, though a small line of worry creased her brow. "Cleaning supplies, mostly, and some specialized tools. Henderson mentioned a pickaxe and some heavy-duty lighting. Said he'd never seen the place so active." A thoughtful frown creased Charles's brow. "A pickaxe? What in God's name is he digging for? Old man's buried treasure?" He chuckled, a brittle sound. "More likely just trying to unblock a drain." "Perhaps," Beatrice said, though her tone suggested she didn't quite believe it. "But it's unnerving, isn't it? The way he just vanished into that old mausoleum. And now these rumours. It feels off, like he's up to something." "Arthur never up to something," Charles scoffed. "Arthur is up to nothing, and always has been. He's probably just trying to make the place presentable enough to sell the scrap metal." He paused, a new thought dawning. Unless he found something. Something the old man hid. Beatrice's eyes widened. Like what? Another pile of worthless patents? A box of his old golf trophies? No, something valuable, Charles insisted, a predatory gleam entering his gaze. The old man was a hoarder, true, but he was also secretive. Remember the stories about his special projects? Always locked away in that office. Never let anyone in. "It's a derelict steelworks, Charles," Beatrice said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "There's nothing there but rust and regret." "Or a hidden safe," Charles mused, rising to his feet. "Or a stash of those rare coins he collected. Or something bigger. Something he didn't want us to find." He strode to the window, peering out at the manicured lawns. "I say we go see for ourselves." A little fraternal visit, just to make sure our dear brother isn't inadvertently setting the place on fire, or worse, finding something he shouldn't. Beatrice considered this, a slow, calculating smile spreading across her lips. A wonderful idea, brother. After all, we wouldn't want him to feel lonely out there all by himself. The next morning, the gleaming black sedan pulled up to the main gate of Sterling Steelworks, a stark contrast to the faded grandeur of the factory. Beatrice, in a pristine cream suit, stepped out, her expression a mix of disdain and forced curiosity. Charles followed, his tailored jacket a jarring splash of colour against the grimy brickwork. The air was different, not the stagnant, dusty quiet they remembered. There was a faint, metallic tang, and a distant, almost imperceptible hum that vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. The main office, once a chaotic repository of forgotten paperwork, looked organised. Files were stacked neatly, the floor swept. Henderson, looking harried but oddly invigorated, met them at the door. "Mr. Charles, Miss Beatrice, a surprise." He glanced nervously over his shoulder. "Arthur is busy." "We heard," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Just thought we'd drop by and see how our diligent brother is getting on. Is he still playing with his pickaxe?" Henderson hesitated. "He's made some progress in the old forge. He asked for privacy." "Nonsense," Charles boomed, striding past him. "He's family. We're here to offer our support. Lead the way, Henderson." They followed the estate manager deeper into the sprawling complex, the hum growing steadily louder, more defined. It wasn't a hum of decay, but of something alive, something working. Dust motes danced in shafts of light filtering through high windows, illuminating a path that was unexpectedly clear of debris. They found Arthur not in the forge, but in a section they barely recognized. A large steel door, previously obscured by years of grime and stacked scrap, now stood slightly ajar. Light, far brighter than the factory's usual dim glow, spilled from within. Arthur stood in the entrance, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy cloth. He wore sturdy work boots, dark trousers, and a faded denim shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal surprisingly muscular forearms. His face, smudged with grease, held an intensity they'd never seen. He looked up as they approached, and for the first time, Beatrice and Charles saw not the timid, easily dismissed younger brother, but a man transformed. His eyes, usually downcast, met theirs with an unwavering, almost challenging gaze. A subtle, confident smile played on his lips. "Beatrice." "Charles," he said, his voice deeper, more resonant than they remembered. "To what do I owe thee? Unexpected pleasure?" He gestured with a hand still holding a wrench towards the brightly lit space behind him. "Come in. I was just about to make a discovery." The confrontation. The air within the newly illuminated section of Sterling Steelworks hummed with an energy Arthur hadn't known possible in this place. It was a stark contrast to the oppressive gloom Charles and Beatrice had become accustomed to, the very picture of their father's failed legacy. Now, bathed in the cool, steady glow of modern LEDs, the vast space felt less like a tomb and more like a slumbering titan, stirring to life. Beatrice, her expensive handbag clutched like a shield, squinted against the brightness. Her polished heels clicked uncertainly on the pristine concrete floor, a world away from the grit and rust she remembered. Charles, ever the one to assert dominance through sheer volume, cleared his throat. the sound echoing a little too loudly in the cavernous expanse. "All right, Arthur. What exactly is this?" Charles demanded, sweeping a hand around, his gaze darting from the high ceilings to the sleek, silent machinery that lay dormant under dust sheets. He tried to project an air of command, but a flicker of genuine bewilderment betrayed him. Arthur, for his part, simply smiled. It wasn't the hesitant, self-effacing smile they knew, but something different, confident, almost knowing. He gestured towards a cluster of digital displays mounted on a nearby wall, currently showing complex schematics and data streams that danced with vibrant colors. "This," he began, his voice calm, devoid of the usual tremor they associated with him, "is the reason I've been so occupied." Beatrice stepped forward, her perfectly sculpted eyebrow arching. "Occupied with what? Polishing old junk?" "Honestly, Arthur, we thought you were finally getting around to selling this monstrosity." She made a dismissive gesture, as if swatting away a particularly annoying fly. "It's not like there's any actual value here." Arthur's gaze met hers unwavering. "Value, Beatrice, is often in the eye of the beholder. Or perhaps in the understanding of what one beholds." He walked towards a control panel, his movements fluid, purposeful. He touched a screen, and a holographic projection shimmered into existence above it, depicting a three-dimensional model of the entire Sterling steelworks, rendered in exquisite detail. But within its familiar outlines, new sections pulsed with a soft, inviting light. Charles's bravado began to fray. He leaned in, his eyes wide with a dawning, unsettling realization. "What are those sections? I've never seen them on any plans." "Our father," Arthur explained, his voice even, "was a man of many secrets and many layers. He built more than we ever knew, and he built it well." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air, thick and palpable. "This isn't merely a defunct steelworks, Charles. It's a hub, a core." Beatrice let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A core of what? More rusty pipes? Spare parts for a factory that closed decades ago?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm, but the edge of desperation was starting to creep in. Arthur turned, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the holographic display. "Let's just say," he mused, a subtle glint in his eye, "that the assets contained within this monstrosity dwarf anything in the Sterling family's current portfolio. Consider the true scale of what Father built, not just what he showed us." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unasked questions and unacknowledged greed. Charles's face, usually ruddy with self-importance, had paled slightly. Beatrice's meticulously applied makeup seemed to crack under the strain of her widening eyes. "Wait a minute," Charles stammered, his voice losing its customary boom. "If there's value here, then it's our value. It's a shared inheritance. We're partners in this, Arthur." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out as if to physically claim the holographic projection. Beatrice, ever quicker to seize an opportunity, chimed in, her voice suddenly sweet, almost cloying. "Exactly, dear brother, we're family, and family shares everything. You've done all the hard work discovering it, of course, but now that it's been found, we must ensure it's managed properly. Perhaps we should bring in a proper team to assess everything, an investment firm maybe, one we all agree on." Her eyes, however, were fixed on Arthur, a predatory glint replacing the earlier disdain. Arthur merely raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement playing on his lips. "Managed, you say, and assessed?" I appreciate your sudden interest in the family's shared assets. He paused, allowing their hopeful expressions to solidify. However, the legalities surrounding this particular section of the inheritance are rather unique, and, as it happens, quite specific to my name. The smiles on Beatrice and Charles's faces dissolved, replaced by a mixture of shock and outrage. The confrontation had begun. The air in the refurbished Sterling Steelworks office, once thick with the scent of old dust and decay, now hummed with the sterile coolness of central air and the faint aroma of fresh paint. Charles, his face a mask of incredulity, pushed away from the sleek glass table. "What are you talking about, Arthur? Sole ownership. This is Sterling property, inherited by all of us." His voice, usually a booming instrument of self-assurance, cracked slightly at the edges. Beatrice, ever the more theatrical, slammed her perfectly manicured hand onto the table. "Don't be ridiculous, Arthur. You think you can just claim this monstrosity, and we'll just stand by? Daddy would never have done such a thing." Her eyes, usually sparkling with calculated charm, now blazed with genuine fury. Arthur, seated calmly at the head of the table, offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. He reached into a slim, leather-bound brief, pulling out a sheaf of documents. They were crisp, official, and bound with a gold seal that glinted under the overhead lights. "Father did many things you never knew about, Beatrice, and he was meticulous in his planning." He slid the papers across the polished surface. "These are the legal instruments, duly notarized and witnessed, transferring specific sections of the Sterling Steelworks property, specifically this hub, as I've come to call it, into a trust established solely for my benefit, effective immediately upon his passing." Charles snatched the top document, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. His brow furrowed, then smoothed into a terrifying realization. This is legitimate. The dates, the signatures, it's all here. His voice was a strained whisper, the bravado draining from him like water from a sieve. Beatrice peered over his shoulder, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized the familiar, elegant script of their father's signature. The colour drained from her face, leaving her usually vibrant features pallid and drawn. The silence in the room stretched, punctuated only by the soft whir of the ventilation system. The clatter of their hopes hitting the hard floor of reality was almost audible. "But why?" Beatrice finally managed, her voice thin and reedy. "Why you, Arthur? Why not us?" The question was steeped in a lifetime of perceived slights and favoured status. Arthur met her gaze, his own eyes clear and unwavering. "Perhaps Father saw something in me that you two consistently overlooked." The sting in his words was subtle, yet potent. He allowed the truth of it to settle, a bitter aftertaste on their tongues. Regardless, the legalities are irrefutable. This section, along with everything within it, is mine, exclusively. He then pressed a button on the comms unit built into the table. "Mr. Henderson, if you please." A moment later, a portly man in a sharp suit carrying a tablet entered the room. "Sir? Please begin the activation sequence for the global network infrastructure. Prioritize the satellite uplinks to the African and South American subsidiaries, and ensure the secure lines to the European energy exchanges are fully operational by end of day." Arthur's voice was calm, authoritative, a stark contrast to the hesitant murmurs of his past. Charles and Beatrice watched, stunned, as Arthur orchestrated what sounded like the genesis of a global enterprise. Henderson nodded, tapping commands into his tablet, the screen flickering with complex data streams. Also, Arthur continued, turning back to his siblings, a predatory gleam in his eyes, I'll be liquidating approximately 10% of the dormant assets held within the vault system to cover initial operational costs and to invest in the newly identified mineral extraction projects in the Atacama. Mr. Henderson, please coordinate with the financial team on that front. Beatrice gaped. Dormant assets? Vault system? What are you talking about? Arthur leaned forward, a subtle smile playing on his lips. Father was a man of foresight. This hub isn't just a steelworks, it's the nerve center of an empire, and I intend to make it thrive. He looked from Charles to Beatrice, their faces a mixture of fury, confusion, and dawning horror. Consider this my calculated comeback. The steel in his voice was palpable, a testament to the transformation within him. The era of the underestimated Arthur Sterling was definitively over. A new Sterling. The Sterling Steelworks, once a skeletal monument to industry's decline, now vibrated with renewed purpose. Arthur, impeccably tailored, moved through its revitalized corridors, his steps resonating with quiet command. He hadn't merely refurbished the dormant sections, he had reimagined them, sculpting a vision entirely his own. Where forgotten machinery once rusted, vast echoing spaces now gleamed with the polished chrome and integrated displays of an advanced R&D facility. Sterling Dynamics, emblazoned above the main entrance, wasn't just a rebranding, it was a pronouncement. His initial ventures had been shrewd gambles, funded by the calculated divestment of his father's more recondite international assets. Early mineral extraction projects targeting rare earth elements critical for cutting-edge electronics had yielded astonishing returns. Arthur, backed by a hand-picked cohort of engineers and data analysts, then pivoted, leveraging this newfound mineral wealth to fuel innovative material science research. Patents swiftly accumulated, each a testament to his meticulous foresight. He wasn't merely tracking trends, he was forging them. Beatrice, her morning coffee steaming in fine porcelain, watched a financial news segment. A smooth-voiced anchor detailed the meteoric ascent of Sterling Dynamics, highlighting its recent acquisition of a major tech startup. Arthur Sterling, the anchor concluded, once an obscure figure, is rapidly emerging as a preeminent innovator in the global market. Beatrice's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her cup. The irony was a bitter tang on her tongue. She and Charles had dismissed Arthur's inheritance as a dilapidated factory, a final, pathetic jest from their eccentric father. Now that jest commanded headlines and generated billions. Did you see this, Charles? She snapped into her phone, her voice sharpened by familiar resentment. Charles, lounging poolside in Monaco, barely acknowledged the tablet displaying the same report. Another one? Good God, he's like a persistent weed. Yet, beneath his dismissive tone, a knot of unease tightened. His own ventures, while profitable, felt diminutive, almost provincial, against the sheer scale of Arthur's expansion. The yachts, the villas, the endless champagne, it all felt diminished, overshadowed by his brother's ever-growing empire. He'd scoffed at Arthur's early talk of global networks and dormant assets. Now, those words echoed with a prescient ring. They observed him from afar, their inquiries into his holdings met with a polite but impregnable legal barrier. Arthur, it seemed, had anticipated their scrutiny, securing his domain with a thoroughness that mirrored his father's own. Every public financial report, every rare and concise interview he granted, painted a portrait of a man utterly transformed. The quiet, almost diffident Arthur of old was gone, replaced by an individual whose gaze held surprising depth, a quiet confidence radiating competence. Arthur, meanwhile, found profound satisfaction in his new existence. He often walked the gleaming floors of Sterling Dynamics late at night, the hum of servers and the gentle glow of monitors his only companions. Here, he felt a tangible connection to his father, an understanding that transcended words. This wasn't merely about wealth, it was about legacy, about building something meaningful, something that pushed the boundaries of possibility. The stress was immense, the hours long, but an invigorating purpose permeated it all. He was no longer the overlooked middle child. He was the architect of his own destiny, and, unbeknownst to him, the inheritor of a far grander fate. He still remembered the precise moment he'd unlocked the hidden passage, the metallic scent of ancient air, the revelation of a world he never knew existed. That moment had been a genesis. Now, standing at the precipice of a new frontier, surrounded by the tangible evidence of his ambition, a quiet pride bloomed within him. The weight of his father's secret, once a burden, had become a launch pad. He was no longer reacting to life, he was actively shaping it. The bitterness of his siblings, their snide remarks, their dismissals, they were distant echoes now, drowned out by the vibrant symphony of his own success. He had built a new Sterling, not just a company, but a new version of himself, forged in the crucible of his father's hidden empire.